everybody. We are the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. I am Dr. Kristen.
And I'm Dr. Erin.
You are exceptionally welcome to our tiny corner of the internet for this final installment of the Colonizers World Tour of 2022. We have been around the globe this year, and in this month, we've been concentrating on Indigenous people groups. First in Australia, then in Canada, then in Alaska, and now in Hawaii, and we're going to be talking about the Kanaka Maoli this week. Let me tell you, we have learned so much. Standard disclaimer here that we always do, which is that no matter how much we learn, we have more to learn. We know that. Our pronunciations may be off because, we Googled them and someone on YouTube taught us how to say them. Our knowledge is always passionate but potentially shallow, and we recognize that. We are two white girls from the continental United States who are children of European immigrants, and colonizers ourselves, and we know that. So we come to this with a spirit of humility and learning and deep curiosity. If you are Kanaka Maoli and we have done something wrong, we would love to be corrected. And we really, really hope that this is taken in a spirit of earnest learning, but we respect that it might not be. We're going to throw this out there. Our passion is that people understand difference than them, as you saw in our trailer, our little credit roll, as it were. We believe in curiosity deeply, and so that's why we do this series. We chose Hawaii for a host of reasons, including that we both knew there was indigenous population there, but didn't know a whole heck of a lot. And so that is one of the reasons we chose the focus. And whoo, buddy, am I glad we did. Darlin, what did you know before we started?
Yeah, enough to whet my appetite, I'd say. I certainly have learned more in the last couple of years as we've had this focus on learning about Indigenous people groups. And I remember a couple of years ago, we had covered a series of Indigenous-made films for Native American Heritage Month, and we got this whole package of films, and included in it was a short
film festival. Yeah.
It was like a whole film festival from Women Make Movies, I think.
Yeah.
And it was a whole film festival, and there was a short film called This Is How We Rise about Jamaica Heloe Mele Kalani. Heloe Mele Kalani. I practiced it 50 times and I still... Osorio. So Jamaica Osorio, who is a slam poet and a scholar and a language speaker and an activist. And it was about them, but also about the protest at Mauna Kea, which I'll be talking a lot more about later. So that was it. And I was ooh, I'm excited to learn more. But then we did all other different colonizations, and so I really didn't learn much in between then and now. So I was excited to be I know Mauna Kea is a protest. Hit me with everything else. How about yourself?
Oh, I completely forgot about that. So that was that was great. When I was recovering from surgery once, back when Netflix had discs, I ordered the disc of a movie called Princess Kaloani, who is was Queen Lelekalani's daughter, who should have eventually been queen, but her mother was overthrown. And I learned, it's from every research I did this week, it's pretty accurate. And my memory is that the Dole Pineapple Corporation overthrew the Hawaiian monarchy to get access to sugar and pineapples.
Yep.
You know what I learned? That's pretty much exactly what happened. President McKinley signed off on it. So I knew some of this. I felt skeevy about buying Dole ever since. And I try my hardest to avoid buying Dole as much as I can. And I have lots of friends that have been to Hawaii. I have a couple friends that lived on Hawaii. They lived in Hilo. And they went with the best of intentions to try to help be part of, the work for a nonprofit that gave back the land and everything else. And it was not sustainable living for them. And so they're back in the continental U.S. But they were very, very honest about their experience there. And what that looked like and how they kind of handled it and worked through it. And they are not Americans. But it was so much more I know it's terrible, but I don't, and I can assume why.
Yeah.
But I was glad to get the data as to why.
Yeah, and I mean, we talked about this when we talked about Alaska or last week, next week. There are huge gaps in the way we teach about statehood, and like how Alaska became a state and why Alaska became a state, and it's the same with Hawaii. So I know we both assume there's more to the story now at this
Always.
stage. We're like, yeah, there's a whole lot we weren't taught about U.S. history. Which makes sense because U.S. history is a nationalist project.
I don't think I was taught about anybody's statehood past the original 13 colonies, to be completely honest. So
I know I was taught about Colorado statehood, but it was probably from a settler colonialist perspective. But yeah, like we don't really talk about it. We're just like, yeah, now we have 50 states and we can sing 50 nifty United States, but we're missing a lot in between. But there's also a lot of similarities to how we behaved with Guam. And colonized Guam and made Guam a military outpost and all of that stuff. So it was interesting to draw those connections, I know, for both of us, and to kind of be like, yeah, this is how the United States imperialism behaves in the Pacific Ocean. Got it. Super.
all right. Well, speaking of the Pacific Ocean, that's where Hawaii is, if you didn't know. And it is only about 2,000 miles from the U.S. mainland. So, a bit out there. It carries a lot of onlys. It is the only state that's an archipelago. It's the only state that's geographically located within the tropics. It's 8 main islands and then a whole bunch of smaller islands, atolls, and reefs. And the whole area that is Hawaii is 6,400 square miles. Again, 2,000 miles off the North American coast.
It's out there.
Population's about 1.4 million. So up there in terms of state populations. But here's the kicker. Only 11% of that is Native Hawaiians. Mm-hmm. And there's going to be a lot of ramifications that come with that as we talk. Languages, English and Hawaiian are the official languages. 73% of Hawaiian residents in the 2000 census speak exclusively English at home, which is actually a little bit lower than I thought it would be. I'm sorry, a little... I don't know which way. That surprises me a little bit, considering 10% of the population is Native Hawaiian. Like, that number doesn't jive with me. So I was interested to see that statistic. There are about 2,000 native speakers now, which is not great.
Well, it's not a lot, no.
It's not a lot. I didn't see a whole lot of calls of people worrying that it was going to get lost because it is well recorded. Unlike some other languages that are not spoken but also not recorded. But obviously it's not great that it's not being spoken. It's a Polynesian member of the Austronesian language family. I read a couple things that kind of said that that people speak Tahitian or something else like that. It sounds a little bit like Hawaiian and people can kind of make it work. And so migrants aren't particularly interested necessarily in learning Hawaiian. They just learn English. Like, that's kind of one of the things. The Kanaka Maoli is the only indigenous population in Hawaii. Everybody else came and conquered and did terrible things. It translates into English as real, genuine, or native people. So, it's what it says on the tin.
Yeah.
The Native Hawaiians are descendants of the original Polynesian settlers of Hawaii. I mean, just obviously, if you don't know, Hawaii is volcanic. That's how it showed up in the world. So humans somebody had to get there because it didn't exist at the Big Bang. So, as my niece would probably tell you that Moana and her Wayfarer family are the ones that got there, but it's not super far off. Huge system of family governance. Obviously live significantly off the land, which for an island nation, it always means the water as well. And the natural world was very much regarded as having spiritual connections. We'll get into that in a few minutes when we talk about the religion. So I think that's it for now, because we're going to hit pause, and I think I'm turning it over to you, and we're going to have a chat about the economy.
Yeah, so I'm going to do just a couple things I want to touch on with like what the economy looks like in Hawaii and the significant factors. Because it is, we can't overstate the fact that it's 2,000 miles away from the U.S. mainland. And there's a lot of similarities to the economy of Guam in that because of colonization and the changing of the nature of the ecosystem and the impact on how the Chamorro people or the Kanaka Maoli people were able to live off the land, because colonization decimated that. Both places are reliant on imports, and they're very, very expensive because it's costly to ship things that far out. So the economy, it's really hard to live in Hawaii if you're from Hawaii. Yep. And there's a boatload of stuff in the downstairs about housing, the economy, jobs. Tourism obviously is the biggest. Agriculture was for a long time, and we'll talk more about that in our history of colonization, because it's very much a capitalist-driven colonization. Capitalism, and then you get late 19th century American imperialism, and that's a lovely combination of just destroying the local communities. So you get that. Housing is a huge issue, and then you have the military.
Yeah.
Very similar to Guam, employs a lot of people, but has a very controversial relationship with the native Hawaiians and with the land. The U.S. military occupies 20% of the land on Oahu. The leases from the Hawaiian government, from the U.S. military, are all up in 2029, which is just a couple of years away. And so there's a lot of push from Kanaka Maoli about not renewing those leases because of the damage that has been done to the ecosystem and the environment and the land and the water. They were lucky enough to secure a 60-year lease for $1 US. So if you want to talk about the difference between Anska in Alaska, which is hugely controversial, but still at least we paid them for their land.
Yep.
$1 for 30,000 acres of Hawaiian land for 60 years. And there's, again, in the downstairs, I just kind of wanted to, on the economy, we're not really going to get super into it, but I wanted to highlight that we have a lot of resources that especially talk about the military occupation, the damage done to Pearl Harbor, which was a significant source of food for the Kanaka. The fact that they just bomb the crap out of this field. It's 300 acres or something of military land that they just drop bombs on all the time.
Cool.
And just leave, it's crazy, y'all. So all of these things are happening that impact the economy and Hawaiian residents, whether they're Kanaka or not, ability to live affordably within the Hawaiian economy. And, tourism was hit really hard, obviously, because of COVID. But then also a lot of mainlanders escaped to Hawaii and brought COVID with them. And so it's created a huge housing crisis because all these people were I have to get out of the United States where there's all this disease, and I'm going to go kill the Hawaiian housing market. It's been banana pants.
My question, really briefly, because I didn't look into this, just like in Guam, where the Hayes Act means that one of the reasons everything is so expensive in Guam is that even if they buy it from Japan, it has to go to mainland America first before it goes back to them.
Yeah.
Is that true for Hawaii as well?
I didn't see if there was something specific. I'll have to look into it. That's a great question. Or if anybody knows and is watching this, just comment on the video. But I did hear a lot of people talking about how expensive imported food is.
Yeah.
in a similar way. So I would imagine it has some kind of like.
I just wasn't sure if that was a
taxes are really
territory versus a state thing. Like, I don't know.
I think it is, and I think the reason why the Hayes Act in Guam is allowed to do that is because Guam is a territory, not a state.
Yeah.
But it's just like you can't sell that kind of stuff cheaply. And so there's a huge movement within Kanaka Maoli people to reestablish their traditional farming methods and the way that they use the land and the water, and kind of changing those food habits back
Right.
to what they once were, so that they aren't so reliant on super expensive exports. But yeah, it's a fascinating, predictable set of issues that are very similar to other areas that we've colonized in the Pacific.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Alrighty, do you want me to do demographics before you jump into colonization?
Yeah, why not? Let's talk about that, and then I'll hit religion and colonization.
Let's do it. Y'all, this is the same story we've told all month. Native Hawaiians still face higher levels of poverty, houselessness, unemployment, incarceration, comorbidity and health issues, lower levels of income and education than the general U.S. population. Native Hawaiians also have one of the worst death and disease rates of any ethnic group in the United States. Substance abuse, suicide, welfare dependency, you name it. According to the 2017 report issued by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, Hawaii has the highest per capita houselessness rate of any state in the United States. And there's a couple articles in the downstairs and videos about the houseless crisis for especially Native Hawaiians right now. Native Hawaiians are overrepresented among the state's homeless. In 2016, 42% of houseless people identified as Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander. And as I said, like the housing costs, the impact of tourism, all of that has made a really, really sticky situation. But when we get to colonization in Amo, I'm going to talk a little bit about the second Hawaiian Renaissance movement that started in the 60s and 70s, that has tried to reestablish traditional arts and culture and language immersion schools, and all of this kind of stuff that's working towards, as I said, maybe disrupting this pattern of economic deprivation and lack of quality jobs and education and under-resourcing this population so that they continue to end up in this government-made crisis.
Yeah. It's really wild to me that even though Hawaii is an island nation, almost all their problems are human-made, which is different than a lot of the other island nations we've discussed and discovered. So, yeah.
And then obviously, like I didn't even say climate change, but obviously climate change.
Obviously climate change. Yeah, obviously.
It's an island nation. It's an island nation in the Pacific. It's got climate issues.
I was really fascinated by studying the religion of it, because so kind of this has a similar missionary history to the Philippines, and a little bit different than some of the other indigenous places that we studied this month. Because there was quite a lot of collusion between the Hawaiian monarchy and the Christian church. And so this was a vibe of like, early Christian Ireland too, where it's like, hey, I need to unify all of these islands. And I'm going to do that through this new religion that seems to be very unifying because there's a structure and a hierarchy. So it's an interesting. We don't see this in many modern colonization stories. Like this one's pretty unique. So the original Hawaiian religion, which obviously many people still practice, is largely symbolized a lot now through the hula dance and the services around the hula dance and things as such. But there are temples and there are sacred spaces and there are all of that. It looks so different. Even like very traditional Hawaiian religion looks so different now than it did in the 16 and 1700s because there's been so much syncretism. There's just been so much. But there's a couple things. It's polytheistic, which is obviously very normal. What makes it, I think, this also made Christianity really attractive is that it's a prohibitive system. So there wasn't a whole lot of conversations around what you can do or what life could give you or anything promising. It's entirely about what you can't do or the gods will be pissed. And so, or largely anyway. And that opens up, I think, that opens them up for a lot of like Jesus came and said that you'll have abundant life. And people were like, oh, it's not as like strict or as mysterious. There's actually kind of written down rules. Some of the stuff I read is that there's so many Hawaiian gods that it felt very capricious, that a lot of like people were always afraid of pissing the Hawaiian gods off. But there's a couple things that definitely have lasted and have stayed. So the Kapua Akua is the law of the gods. And a lot of that has to do with structuring mana. And mana is the spiritual energy that is infused in all living things and people. I love this connection, by the way, because it's almost the same word we have for that in Hebrew. And so I just love when that happens. But the thing I really I appreciate about this is that Hawaiians believe that mana exists in words. And words themselves have living power in them.
Wow.
In a really beautiful way that we've never, which is one of the reasons, again, hula is a form of worship. The chants that are done during hula are very specific. The words are very specific because the words carry mana and the words describe the body movements, or at least if they don't describe the body movement, they describe the meaning behind the body movement. The words are kind of what imbues hula with mana in one of the stories I read, which I really loved.
Yeah.
Even though they are polytheistic, they do have four main gods: a god of war, a god of sky. So Ku is war, Kane is sky, Lono is peace and fertility, and Kanaula is the ocean. So you can always tell a lot about a people when what their four main gods are a part of. So peace, propagation of the species, sky and water, and war. War is the reason why King I forgot how to say it already. Can you help me?
Kamehameha.
Kamehameha. He kind of gathered everybody together in terms of the island. Yeah. He had a lot of war and he was trying to unify. And one of the ways that he did that was to institute a relationship with the Christian church, specifically the various Protestant churches. Catholics didn't show up until later. It was very Protestant led. It was the Baptists were there first. And if anyone was going to show up first and do this, honestly, Baptists are kind of the best because their theology is pretty laid back and allows for more of this syncretism. If the Lutherans had shown up, it would have been a different ballgame.
Oh boy.
A great kind of like, hey, we don't use this word anymore, or you can know what it really means, is kahuna, is not just for like the leader of your friends at tailgates. Kahuna is the spiritual advisor of the family unit, whatever that looks like, that is part of it. Kahuna is a really big deal. And Kahuna Nui is the chief spiritual advisor out of all of them. So a Kahuna Nui is like the Pope.
Right.
And so kahuna is a great word to avoid using unless you are actually talking about a spiritual advisor.
Sure. So we're going to put that in there with guru and Sherpa and
shaman. Yeah.
Shaman.
That we learned last week. So like I said, the relationship between institutionalized religion and colonization is significantly more in Hawaii. So the first white folks that showed up in Hawaii in a large scale, anyway, I'm sure randos showed up before this, was in 1788 when Captain James Cook arrived and he called them the Sandwich Islands. So if you're reading old like romance novels and they're talking about the Sandwich Islands and you're like, what the hell are those? It's Hawaii.
Hawaii.
So there was around 1 million people there when he showed up, and with all of his diseases that he brought and his people bought, they went down to 33,000. There was again a whole lot of separate chieftains, and King Kamehameha really wanted unity, and he wanted the Brits to help, and the Brits were like, for once in their damn lives. My guess is it was too far.
Too far away?
And they had already lost Guam? I don't know.
I was like, in what world do the Brits not want to colonize? I need more time to research that, but I was like, as I was researching this, I was like, I'm sorry, what?
Yeah, it's got to be that they couldn't do a strategic port. It was too far away from other things. It's got to be.
Because they didn't do a whole lot in the Pacific, so I think that's probably they were like too far.
Yeah, they left that to the Dutch and then the Americans. Yeah. France formally recognized it as a full kingdom and an independent state. France agreed to not take ownership over it. This is significant too, because almost no other Pacific island wrangled these kind of agreements out of major powers. So what you should take from this is that King Kamehameha's strong sense of unity is a huge part of what created what it meant to be Hawaiian. Mm-hmm. And he's the first one who really did this in a way that, he is their George Washington in the level of deification of a human is what this has happened. However, Hawaii and the U.S. recognized it in 1844. This took way too long. Everybody else recognized it by 1810, and was they were late. So again, I want to reiterate that the U.S. did recognize it as a formal independent kingdom in 1844.
Dun dun dun.
In the middle of all of this is happening, again, King Kamehameha shows, he dies in 1819, I think it was. Hold on, I have this written down. Yeah, he died in 1819. So all of the, unification stuff was done between 1805 and 1815. And he set up, you see reports of huge arrivals of missionaries in the 1820s. That's the American missionaries. The British Baptist Convention and the British Baptists came over in 1805, 1806. And that's who really set up everything with King Kamehameha to convert him to Christianity and then therefore convert the islands to Christianity. And honestly, they were okay until, the French were kind of Frenching around, the Brits were being obnoxious. But, for most of the 1800s, they did okay. Until 1875 and something called the Treaty of Reciprocity. What that did was introduce economic disparity into Hawaii in a way that it had never been formalized before outside of the monarchy. So it didn't introduce capitalism. Capitalism was there. It is what took capitalism and started to dip it into unregulated capitalism, really, is what the Treaty of Reciprocity is. What it technically did was limit the tariffs on sugar. And so the people that could grow sugar on the island and could grow pineapples on the island then started to control the entire wealth of the island. And that population was 1% of everybody. So this is the real turning point of everything. This is where we get into all of the fun stuff. So then the Americans start to realize that they need this, for the Spanish-American War. The Dole Pineapple Company needs this place to continue to grow their pineapples. There's a pesky monarchy. And so what did we do about that monarchy? They imprisoned Queen Luluakani. She wanted to restore power to the Hawaiians. She went all the way to Washington. Again, in 1898, it's 2,000 miles off the coast. Then the girl's got to get herself from San Diego to Washington. Woman was passionate. President McKinley's like, oh yeah, I totally agree with you. You should have sovereignty. And then one of his advisors goes, psst, we need the land. And he goes, oh shoot, we need the land, and denies her request. She died pretty much in captivity and exile. Even though she was free, but not really. It's what's really interesting is that was the annexation of Hawaii, the late 1800s. At that point, there was in popular newspapers and in some other things, many Americans were on the side of the Hawaiians. There's actually quite a lot of evidence that she did a great PR campaign, and people were like, that, oh, no. Because the other thing to kind of realize is that unlike Manifest Destiny, American imperialism in the late 1800s was really just the government. It wasn't a popular American movement.
Right.
Manifest
Yeah.
Destiny had everybody by the throat. Imperialism did not.
Yeah. And even I think like the quote that absolutely killed me was from, so the coup was in 1893. It was staged by the plantation oligarchs, really.
Yeah.
But then aided by the U.S., a U.S. minister and support from the Marines. But Grover Cleveland was president at the time. And y'all, we just have to like tell you this quote from the President of the United States. By an act of war committed with the participation of a diplomatic representative of the United States and without authority of Congress, the government of a feeble but friendly and confiding people has been overthrown. That was the President of the United States talking about the fact that without U.S. government approval, U.S. government agents overthrew a sovereign nation.
Like, my headcanon of this moment is like Cleveland has no idea, and he's just like in a meeting and someone goes, oh, by the way, we own Hawaii now, and he's like, what? I didn't.
Yeah. I didn't authorize this.
I didn't authorize. Did it? Congress, did you authorize this? Why are we violating the Constitution? And then somebody went, we're going to make a lot of money from sugar. And he went, I'm okay with it now.
Well, I think, too, it's like we don't know necessarily what would have happened to Hawaii if McKinley hadn't, like, the presidential election, I think, was, like, the next year or something.
Yeah.
And McKinley was elected.
And
I don't know enough
Cleveland
about...
didn't care about imperialism the way that McKinley did. Like, it was McKinley and then Teddy Roosevelt that were like, let's conquer the damn world. Because it was Seward at that point was the Secretary of State for one of them.
Right. And, like, that's when we started, like, interfering in, like, Central America and South America and...
Oh, guys, just wait till we get to Argentina. Just get excited.
Just get excited about it now. But, yeah, like... We elected an imperialist president, and he was like, I don't care if it was an act of war. I don't care if we overthrew a sovereign nation. We need that strategic outpost, especially like at the start of the Spanish-American War. And that's really, we're like, oh, it would be helpful if we had that land. So let's reconsider annexation.
Yeah, and so...
Crazy.
But I find it really heartening. Like I went on the Library of Congress, had a bunch of microfiche, God love it, of newspapers, and there was op-eds in the New York Times and what is now the Washington Post that were like, this was wrong and we should give Hawaii back.
Yeah.
So what changed, you ask? World War I and II. That's what changed. That and World War II absolutely made everyone feel like Hawaii was American. And a huge part of that, and I don't even think this was FDR's, like, goal in these statements, but because it was a territory of the U.S. at that point, he talked about the attack on Pearl Harbor as an attack on our nation. Mm-hmm. And that led everyone really easily to believe that Hawaii already was a country, like, was a state, or was on its way there. So they held a referendum. They didn't ask any of the Kanaka Maoli. They asked all the other folks living there. And it was like, yeah, we want a statehood. And I understand if you are not Kanaka Maoli, if you are an immigrant from anywhere else, if you are a migrant worker from the Philippines, or you are, and they're like, hey, you can become an American citizen, explain to me why you wouldn't vote for that. Like, that sounds like a great idea. But by not including the indigenous population, you're missing a huge story there. I'm not surprised the referendum passed at all. It was almost going to be like the natural conclusion of the annexation, because the annexation just kind of became like quiet statehood. Like, I mean, how many people now have any idea what our relationship with Guam is? They don't. If Guam was a state, they like wouldn't think twice about it. So from a foreign policy perspective, if the Japanese hadn't bombed Pearl Harbor, I think that referendum would have went differently. But once they did, and once FDR starts using that, it was American soil, we're going into this because you bombed American soil, even though it really wasn't, there was no turning back. There was just it was always, at that point then, I think, going to be a state.
Yeah, and I think, like, it's also worth noting that had we not decimated the Kanaka Maoli population over 100 years of colonization, there would have been more Native Hawaiians who could have spoken up. Like,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
so, you know, they weren't the majority population by that time, by 1959. It was the highest population of Asians in any state. You had migrants from Japan, the Philippines. You had a lot of migrants from the U.S. mainland. And you're right. I think, like, especially after the Second World War, for the majority of those people, I'm sure statehood seemed like a good idea. But I think that leads into kind of the tail end of this story of colonization, which is the Second Hawaiian Renaissance movement, which, shocking no one. So the referendum for statehood was 1959. That's when both Alaska and Hawaii were made states.
And let me tell you, before this week, I would have told you that both of them were states before World War II. Because
Easily.
of the language we used about Pearl Harbor, I absolutely would have sworn that it was like 1935 that Hawaii became a state. So this was really shocking to me, that it was not till 1959.
I feel like we should all be required to take a history class growing up that's like the history of statehood.
Seriously. And because now I'm even curious, like, we travel a lot to a lot of different places. I'm like, how did Kansas become a state? Like,
I know.
When I was in Maine last week, I found out that Maine became a state because of the Missouri Compromise. I didn't know that. It was part of Massachusetts until the 1800s?
Sure.
Okay.
I didn't know that. Yeah, we 100% need, like, we should do that. We should do, like, a separate Colonizers World Tour, like, history of statehood. Sometime when we have time.
I mean, there are 52 weeks of the year, so we could potentially spend a year doing it. It would be a lot.
Who knows? Who knows, folks? Maybe we'll do it. Maybe we'll find someone
Let
else
us know
who's
if you
done
want
it
us to.
and share it. Yeah, but no, it's crazy. I would have definitely placed it before, especially Hawaii. I would have placed before.
Yeah, Alaska, I think I
World War
understood
II.
was later, but like, no. I mean, how many times in my life have I listened to that damn Pearl Harbor speech? That he was speaking about American lives and America. It would have never occurred to me it was a territory, not a state. Never.
I know.
Ever.
I know. So speaking of the late 1950s, this is when, you know, there's no coincidence that a rise in kind of fervor within Native Hawaiian peoples and a lot of changes happening within a movement towards a greater cultural renaissance, recognition, official state recognition, all of these things. It's what's called the Second Hawaiian Renaissance. The first Hawaiian Renaissance was considered during the time of King Kamehameha. And it starts really the late 1950s. You get the Hawaiian Dictionary. The first Hawaiian Dictionary is formally created in 1957. And then it goes from there into the 1960s and the 1970s. You get the Hawaiian language is offered at the Kamehameha schools in 1961. And then you get the establishment of festivals, educational programs, all sorts of things. And then also a lot of protests over environmental and land rights issues. So, you know, there's no official, like, this is the day that the Hawaiian Renaissance movement started. But a lot of people locate it as well in 1971. Especially kind of the modern age of land rights and environmental-led protests that we're seeing now, with evictions that happened in the Kalama Valley in 1971. And then there was also a major protest in 1976 on the Navy target island, which is exactly what it sounds like. It was an island that was just a target for the Navy. Kaho'olawe. And you see this formation of direct action movements and protests that are integral to the cultural renaissance and this understanding of what it means to be Kanaka and to be stewards of the land. And it's such a huge part of a spiritual philosophy and an understanding of what it means to be Kanaka Maoli, that it is no surprise at all that these kind of protests were a part of the Renaissance movement. And especially for Kaho'olawe, the army finally withdrew in 1994. So
Wild to me. Wild.
good job, U.S. Army. seriously just look at some of the stuff in the show notes about the U.S. military in Hawaii. I learned so much, and it's all upsetting. We officially apologized for overthrowing a sovereign nation in 1993. It literally says in the apology resolution, the Congress, on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the illegal overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii. We wrote it down. And then we're still just like, oh, it's a state. No, it's not. It's just
like that can't be a
pants.
binding referendum if we were illegal anyway. Okay.
Like how? Like statehood can't be legal.
We could just swap Washington D.C. for Hawaii, and we don't even need new flags.
Exactly. Same number. Before I get into talking about Mauna Kea as our human rights spotlight, I want to briefly say that it's really interesting that the Kanaka Maoli do not have federally recognized tribal status.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. Which makes a lot of sense when you consider them a military occupied sovereign nation. So they are not recognized as a tribal nation unlike a lot of other federally recognized tribes in the United States. So there is no formal relationship between them and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And this is because they're within the sovereignty movements and the Native Hawaiian movements. They don't want federally recognized status because then that federally puts them like within the United States, and they constantly argue that the United States has no right to regulate anything to do with them because it's an illegal occupation. So there was a bill called the Akaka Bill in 2000 that was proposed by Senator Daniel Akaka of Hawaii, which would have given them status, but like the bill's never passed because the Kanaka Maoli are like, y'all can't regulate a sovereign nation. Thank you so much. So it, again, like Hawaii and Alaska have such interesting relationships with colonization, and you know what it means, what a lack of federal status means is that they can't access a lot of the government benefits necessarily that come with being federally recognized, like the IHS, the Indian Health Service, and like all these other things. But when their idea of sovereignty is so significant to how they see themselves, like what is a health service to your identity. And speaking of identity, there were obviously a lot of things that we could have talked about for human rights issues in Hawaii. We touched on some of them throughout this video. But I wanted to especially highlight the recent protests happening at Mauna Kea, which is a hugely significant mountain to the Kanaka Maoli people, and a good, I felt like, case study for understanding Native Hawaiian human rights. So the quote, and I got all this information literally from the beautiful humans at the All My Relations podcast, who right before COVID, like literally January 2020, went to Hawaii and spoke with the leaders of the protests at Mauna Kea, academics, educators, cultural leaders, kapuna, and there's a 3-part podcast episode series on there. Listen to it. It's fantastic. I learned so much, and I'm literally just pulling information from that to tell y'all. So in the This Is How We Rise video, Jamaica Osorio says, "We are not anti-science, but as Hawaiians, we understand that science that requires desecration is not ethical." And that is fundamentally the issue at Mauna Kea. Lanakila Manguel is an educator and a leader, and he's one of the leaders of the protests at Mauna Kea, and he really describes why it's such a sacred, significant place. It is their most sacred mountain. It is fundamental to the Kanaka's creation story and their way of understanding their being and their relations. They consider that the mountain is the eldest of all of their siblings. It is a burial ground, especially for the kapuna, which are elders Chiefs, priests, and those who are related to the deities that Kristen mentioned, they also see the Mauna as an umbilical cord that connects them to the land and the earth. And it is literally their spiritual tether to this place. So they see the development of the mountain as a cancer within the umbilical cord, rather evidently. Lanakila like talks about the meaning, like what Mauna Kea means. And a lot of people think it means like white mountain, because Mauna is mountain and Kea is often thought to be white. But really, he explains the linguistic root of Kea is purity. So it is this holy place, literally. It is this sacred place. And that's why I wanted to share that quote from Jamaica Osorio, that like science that requires desecration is not ethical.
Yeah.
They are not anti-science. There are Native Hawaiian astronomers who have worked on Mauna Kea at one of the like telescopes. Like, this is not about this backwards, quote unquote, anti-science people. Because the land is a huge part of who they are. And, what Lanakila said was, without the land, we have no culture. Because it is that significant. So the story of Mauna Kea is that in the late, I think in the 1980s was the first time they built a telescope on Mauna Kea. And there's a whole reason why Mauna Kea is significant place to put telescopes because of the climate up top and what you can see and all of this. So the first telescopes were built in the late 1980s without permits and without consent. They got the permits afterwards. There are now 13 telescopes and other structures, roads, and power lines. Between 500 and 1,000 people go up the mountain on a given day. The University of Hawaii owns the land, but has done nothing for the conservation. They just kind of opened it up for tourism and astronomy and said, like, do you want to build a telescope? Build a telescope. And so in 2009, the 30-meter telescope, which is known as TMT, was proposed and immediately met with opposition. And this came to a head in 2014 when a group of people stopped the groundbreaking ceremony. Lanakila was a part of that. And there has been a resistance camp at Pu'uhuluhulu since 2019. So that's probably what people have seen on the news. It was all over YouTube. Jason Momoa went because he's of Hawaiian heritage, and really highlighted what was happening at Mauna Kea. And so they have sort of stopped the development of the TMT on Mauna Kea because they view it as desecrating their sacred space. The burial grounds have been destroyed and disturbed. The shrines have been destroyed and disturbed. And it has done a lot of damage to the ecosystem on the Mauna, which has a lot of endemic species, which means they exist nowhere else in the world. It is a very fragile ecosystem that is integral to how the island of Hawaii operates and functions, and the whole ecosystem of the islands. So, I thought it was a good example of kind of this, a pinnacle of the cultural renaissance, where you have generations of people who have been language learners, historians, educators, activists, environmentalists, that all coalesced in Mauna Kea at the end, right before the pandemic. The protest site had to be shut down for health reasons. Hawaii actually had like a really strict COVID protocol. But for the sake of the health and safety of the people, they had to shut it down. So there hasn't been more movement yet, I think, in terms of building the TMT. The Hawaiian Supreme Court actually rules in favor of the Kanaka Maoli from time to time, which is helpful. But it's I think, worth keeping an eye on. And if you want to learn more about it, I learned so much about Kanaka Maoli, and it developed the deepest understanding that I have for who they are as people in listening to those podcast episodes. So I thought it was a good case study to kind of say, this is what is happening contemporaneously. There's some fantastic voices and humans that are speaking about. And I think, too, because from the outside it can look like, you know, people are protesting the advancement of humanity. You know, like, we can talk about the Dakota Access Pipeline as just like capitalism that was going to damage the environment. But a lot of pro-science people want there to be telescopes that are accessible. And, you know, these people, if you listen to them, are not saying no telescopes. They're just saying don't build the telescope on the mountain. So I think that is what we have to say about the Kanaka Maoli people, aside from our Jeopardy facts. Kristen, my dear, did you have one?
I didn't. I think because nothing that I learned I could think of as a question on Jeopardy. Because I'm like, oh, I'm really fascinated that, you know, they had a prohibitive religious system. And like, maybe that King Kamehameha is the one who united the whole islands through war and religion, but is noted as the father of the Renaissance, and they named schools after him. That might be like that.
He's a complicated fella.
That tension might be my answer. Yeah. What about you?
Yeah. So my gut reaction was that, according to the Kanaka Maoli and U.S. laws, Hawaii is a sovereign nation that is currently under an illegal U.S. military occupation.
Yeah, that apology just blew my mind. I was like, we wrote it down and okay.
Like, literally, according to the laws that our nation upholds, we have illegally occupied that sovereign nation since, like, 1891. That absolutely blew my mind. I will tell everyone that all the time. Mm-hmm. Did you know that Hawaii is not legally a state? But I think the other thing that was fascinating was a history of surfing that I watched. Obviously, wave riding and surfing is a Polynesian cultural tradition and very much a part of being Native Hawaiian. But it also has to do with statehood, because there was this white dude named Ford, hilariously, of course, from South Carolina, who moved to Hawaii and was like, there's way too many Asians and brown people here, y'all. We can't have it. I'm going to start promoting surfing to white folks to get white folks here so we can have a white state. And if that's not the most South Carolinian, Southern, conservative attitude, and you and I love South Carolina. We love a lot of different folks and different strokes from South Carolina. But I was like, oh boy, oofta. But yeah, I was like, oh, cool. So the reason that surfing is so popular, one of the reasons, is capitalism and statehood.
Well then.
We never stop learning on this Colonizers World Tour, y'all. And we won't. We are for this year. But next year we'll be back.
We will indeed. And some of next year's highlights include the Belgian colonies. So guys, get super excited for me to scream about King Leopold in at least 2 languages. Because my hatred of him cannot be contained to the English language.
It cannot. We will tell you about our trip to Brussels.
And the Belgian National Museum.
And the Belgian National Museum, because it was one of the most horrifying things we've seen in a museum space. Oh, boy.
I just remember like my entire body shutting down and like needing to get out of there so that I could tell you why I was so mad.
I think that was the day that we went and you drank like out of the giant
Yeah. I drank out of the giant horn because I was like, I can't feel my feelings right now. I need to be numb.
We went to the piss statue and got drunk. That was the rest of the day.
That was our reaction to the Belgian National Museum. We're also going to be dipping into Russian territories and colonies for the first time. And spending a little bit more time in Africa because we're going to talk about the British colonies in Africa. So, couple really great stops. Next year, I think we're going to be spending a whole lot of time in India. Is going to be one of our country focuses. So you're not going to want to miss it. Make sure you're subscribed to our channel so you don't miss it. But good news, as a little bonus, we have one more video for you. And it's coming tomorrow. And it's our piece of indigenous art from the Kanaka Maoli. And we're going out on a high note, guys. This is one of my favorite movies we've watched for Colonizers World Tour. It's up there with the Brazilian rom-com. I still can't get out of my head.
It was a gem.
It was a true delight. Can't wait to introduce you to it. The Haumana, excuse me. And can't wait to see you tomorrow or next in the playlist.
Bye.